Chapter 4 Geyser of Oil. There wasn't a trace or a cloud in the sky. The weather was cold and invigorating, and smoke was rising from every chimney in Beaumont on the morning of January 10th, 1901. Patillo Higgins rode off into the north wind toward Hardin County to complete a deal that would get him out of debt. He had located a strip of timberland that Frank Keith would buy. Al Hamill was in the freight depot early to pick up the new fishtail bit from Corsicana. It was barely daylight when he and Higgins exchanged greetings as they passed each other on Park Street. After a brief visit to the well, Captain Lucas returned to his home on the way to town to tell Carolyn he would be in Louis Mayer's store on Crockett Street. The Morning Enterprise gave its usual reports of the local, national, and world events. The district attorney, who had been supported by George Carroll in the recent election, would start a war on gambling. A big diamond discovery was reported from Capitan near El Paso. Dr. Walter Reed announced his famous discovery of the carrier of yellow fever. Old Tom Sharkey was crying for another crack at Kid McCoy. William Jennings Bryan was due to visit Houston, and Al G. Field's Minstrels and Sousa's band were booked into the Goodhue Opera House. Mayor Wheat returned from Washington without selling the city's improvement bonds. Governor Sayers was to open the new session of the state legislature in Austin. Beaumont was not prepared for the dramatic excitement that was now only hours away. Its 9,000 inhabitants were satisfied with conditions as they were. Beaumont had a chamber of commerce, solid citizens, culture, and magnolias. It was as cosmopolitan as any city in the South. A fourth of its citizens were Negroes. Many of its successful merchants were Jews. Almost every other white man and most of the Negroes spoke a Louisiana patois. It had a healthy immigrant population, particularly Italians. There was a Dutch settlement just south of town called Nederland. Beaumont was more southern than southwestern, but it did have a few cowpokes. It was a pleasant place to live. It had few animosities and a minimum of prejudices. All in all, it was a model American small town. On the hill, the crew of 3 had put on the new fishtail bit. That done, the drill stem was lowered back into the hole, with the pipe down about 700 feet, and Kurt Hamill steering it from the double boards, 40 feet above the derrick floor. Something began to happen. Mud started to bubble up over the rotary table. Al and Peck backed away when suddenly the force increased, and mud spurted high up the derrick. Kurt, drenched with mud and gumbo, grabbed for the ladder and slid down it to safety. All 3 scampered in different directions. This was a new experience for these old hands of the Corsicana field. As they ran, 6 tons of 4-inch pipe came shooting up through the derrick, knocking off the crown block. Then the pipe leapt. like activated spaghetti, on over the top of the derrick and broke off in sections, falling around the camp like giant spikes driven into the earth. Then everything was quiet. The Hamels and Peckbeard cautiously returned to the derrick floor. It was a shambles, with mud, muck, and water standing a foot deep. The disgusted crew looked over the situation, started cleaning up the debris, and expressed themselves in a manner of eloquence reserved for men of the oil fields. "What the hell are we going to do with the damn thing now?" Peckbeard asked Al as he shut off the boiler fires. "Well, Peck," Al was saying, "I guess we'll just have to shovel this mud away and see if—" His words were interrupted by a roar like the shot of a heavy cannon. Then again the flow of mud started up through the hole, followed by a terrific column of gas. The startled crew scattered again. Peck missed his footing and tumbled headlong into the slush pit. Within seconds, the gas was followed by a solid flow of oil, green and heavy. "Peck, run to the house and get the captain," Al shouted, while Kurt and me try to figure this thing out. "It looks like oil. Hurry, hurry." The mud-soaked Peckbeard ran to the Lucas home. When he got there, he was out of breath and sat holding his side, panting a few minutes, before he could deliver the message to Miss Lucas. "Get the captain. Tell him to come right now," Peck shouted in excitement. "Look, Miss Lucas, look," he said, pointing to the well. But before she could find out what had happened, Peck was off on a run back to the well. She looked toward the hill and saw a great plume of black liquid spouting over the derrick. The sight was fantastic. She could not explain what had happened, but she implored the captain to lose no time in getting back to the hill. "Hurry, Anthony. Something awful has happened. The well is spouting," she shouted into the telephone. The captain turned and fled from the store without explanation. He mounted his gig as Louis Mayer watched in astonishment and stood on the floorboards whipping his horse as he raced out Park Street, past the O'Brien and Carroll homes, out Highland Avenue, and past his own home, without even looking toward his wife, who was trying to attract his attention by waving from the porch. The phenomenon was in full view now. It was frightening to the captain. His eyes had never beheld such a sight before. Could it be oil? When he reached the hill, Lucas' excitement was too much, and the horse was too slow. At the apex of the hill, he tried to jump from the buggy and tumbled down the slope. Al Hamel saw the fall and started toward him, but the captain rolled forward and came to his feet on a dead run. "Al, Al," he was shouting. "What is it? What is it?" "Oil, Captain, oil. Every drop of it," the jubilant Al replied, grabbing Al Hamel by the waist and swinging him around. Lucas looked up toward the gray skies and said, thank God, you've done it. You've done it. It came in at 10:30, almost an hour ago, and it has been shooting a steady 6-inch stream of oil more than 100 feet above the top of the derrick, just like it is now. I can't understand it, Al said, but I don't think we are going to pay George Carroll for that derrick. Captain Lucas was exultant. He stood under the shower of green oil, felt it, smelled it, and tasted it to make certain he wasn't dreaming. Then he backed off and looked up to the top of the great plume. Oil, shale, and rocks were raining down. Almost to himself he whispered hoarsely, with a rising inflection, "A geyser of oil! A geyser of oil!" Farmers, ranchers, and everyone living within sight of the great geyser started converging on the hill. They were amazed and puzzled. They were coming afoot and by horseback, wagon, buggy, carriage, and bicycle. Charlie Ingalls, a carpenter farmer, stood under the well a few minutes, then mounted his horse and headed for Beaumont. Like an oil-saturated Paul Revere, he rode past houses, shouting, "Oil, oil on the hill!" And more people came out of their houses, looked south, and started for Gladys City. As he rode down Pearl and Crockett streets, he continued shouting his message, "It's oil on the hill, and the damn stuff has ruined my home and farm," he yelled at the townspeople. The news rocked Beaumont as if it had been hit by an earthquake. People rushed from their half-eaten meals, from homes and cafes. They came out of commissaries, stores, barber shops, and salons, and, like feathers being drawn by a giant vacuum, started toward the hill. Every available mode of conveyance was filled. The livery stables were emptied. Those who couldn't get a ride began to walk. The courthouse, Beaumont's only tall building, was crowded with men, women, and children climbing out on its roof and into every window. The well was clearly visible from the upper floors. In the wake of the excitement, stores and shops were left abandoned. Half-shaven customers from barber shops ran down the street. In the south end of the town, a teacher at a blackboard was deserted by a class, including young Tony Lucas, who had heard and seen the well when it roared in. Panic-stricken livestock scurried and stampeded over the prairie away from the hill. The superstitious saw and heard the well and ran in the opposite direction, some of them shouting that the world was coming to an end. Passengers on the Sabine and East Texas train saw the well and were curious but disappointed as the train kept moving. By early afternoon, hundreds were gathered around the hill. They were coming from Beaumont and Port Arthur and every village and hamlet in the county. Perry McFadden, one of the landowners of the well site, began to recruit workers from the spectators to help dig a ditch around the site, keep people back, and prevent smoking. The Hamels warned of the danger of fire, which could turn the well into a holocaust. At the moment, few realized they were watching an event far more important to the progress of civilization than most of the wars of the world combined. Nowhere else on earth had such a sight ever been seen before except in Russia. Carrie Lucas had followed her excited husband up the road to the hill. There she joined him in his jubilation. When they were back home, the captain sent a telegram to John Galley, urging him to rush to Beaumont and see the geyser of oil. By early afternoon, Beaumont was teeming with excitement. Everywhere men were gathered in small groups talking about the hill and how they were going to get there. Many farmers and businessmen who were struggling for a living would be wealthy within a few days. They were the millionaires-to-be that Batillo Higgins had talked about, while they scorned and later pitied him. Now they realized that his predictions had come to pass. It was Captain George O'Brien who, after listening to reports and discussing them, on the post office corner turned to the group there and said, slowly but seriously, "Batillo Higgins told all of us this would happen. I am ready to take my hat off to him." The others agreed. Beaumont was proud, at last, of this native son whose interest had never flagged, and whose determination always matched the resistance to his efforts. Captain Lucas was the man of the hour. His struggles and disappointments had become street gossip. Some who had virtually invited him out of their offices when he sought local capital now claimed his friendship. No longer was he the silent stranger the newspapers had warned against leasing land to a few weeks back, while the Chamber of Commerce had appointed a committee to help J.A. Paulhamus get leases. The newspapers had said editorially, "The leases are not for bona fide development, but for the Standard Oil Company to serve its own purposes and retard development." Those days were all over. Captain Lucas had succeeded where others had failed. He was a genius, a gentleman, a developer, and a godsend to this community, even if it was Standard that was backing him. What of it? Today Beaumont recognized a man most of its citizens had ignored and avoided for a year and a half. It was a cold and weary Batillo Higgins who heard the news of the geyser of oil from Jim Coller. Higgins was undemonstrative, but he was more excited than he let Jim Coller think he was. Riding down Pearl Street toward his home, he was hailed by the little knots of men gathered on every corner. They spoke to him with a respect that approached reverence. Several of his loyal friends shouted, "They can call you millionaire now without laughing, Bud." That night Batillo Higgins looked over a proposed plan for the Higgins Oil Company. He had listed the men he would ask to go into the venture, his 33-acre tract, which he bought with the settlement for his undivided interest in the Gladys City Company years before, was 200 feet north of the Lucas Well. His company would not be a promotion. The associates he had in mind were men who had the cash that he did not have to put in for operations. It would mean letting his partners have a majority of the stock, but it would be a company that would be solid and a credit to Beaumont. He would sell his 33 acres to this company for $5,000 and take a good block of the stock for himself. Batillo Higgins considered another plan in his office that night. It was a plan to file suit against both Captain Anthony F. Lucas and his old friend George Washington Carroll. He didn't like it, and he hoped something would happen in the next few days to make it unnecessary, but he was aware of being left out of the new Lucas Gladys City deal, and did not intend to stay in the dark much longer. His former associates, who had neither consulted with nor informed him of the new arrangements, would either give him an explanation or the courts would provide one. The rest of the world was not prepared for the news that was now flowing out of Beaumont in volumes equal to the oil from the spouter on the hill. The first flash went out about 1 o'clock, based on Charlie Ingall's eyewitness account. Later, there was confirmation from others, including farmers, near the site, who were called by reporters. Finally, the newsmen went to the well to see for themselves. Long-distance telephone calls from Beaumont swamped the meager switchboard facilities. The telegraph offices were overtaxed. The result was that the evening trains brought the greatest offloading of passengers in the little town's history. It was the vanguard of an invasion force that would continue to grow by the hour. Beaumonters, long hungry for excitement, and now almost satiated with it in a matter of hours, made the Crosby House their gathering point. It was across the street from the railway station, where the new arrivals could be met and greeted. Late into the night there was a hubbub and an activity which was the inauguration of an atmosphere that would grow into a crescendo of shouts and bids and chaotic confusion as the days and nights passed. Every saloon in town kept its doors open after hours. Several, including the Crosby Bar, didn't close. They could have thrown away their keys, because from this night forward they wouldn't need them. By morning the details of the Lucas Well were being read in newspapers around the world, as if the giant vacuum had increased its range. The railroads of the nation became arteries of activity, pointing toward Beaumont. Large newspapers ordered staff members to go immediately to see and report back the facts on this wonder well. Its appeal was greater than that of the California Gold Rush or the Klondike. It had human interest, and it portended industrial potentialities of unlimited scope. The Beaumont newsmen had performed nobly in telling the first news of the incident, and they had done so without resorting to exaggeration. Their early dispatches said the well was producing 30,000 barrels. There would be lower estimates later, but even that was less than a third of the 100,000 barrels a day it was actually flowing. It was some time after midnight when a special train arrived from Galveston and Houston, bringing, among others, David R. Beatty, who would later become one of the most fabulous characters in the history of early Texas oil development. Captain Lucas was at the well before daylight, and so was a reporter from the Journal. Asked for an estimate of the flow, Lucas said 6,000 barrels a day. He had never heard of a larger well in America. Then he pointed to the diminished flow indicated by the oil now spouting only slightly over the top of the derrick, and expressed the hope that the well might soon be controlled. As dawn was breaking, the captain told Al Hamel that Miss Lucas had insisted that he come home for breakfast. None of the crew had been able to leave the well since it broke loose. The invitation was accepted after Kurt assured Al that the situation was well in hand. Miss Lucas was serving the coffee as the captain showed Al 2 giant cabbages he had received the evening before. They are from an Italian friend of mine who sold a lease for $5,000 yesterday, and gives me credit for making him rich. Lucas laughed. He had a bad conscience. 2 days ago I met him downtown. He told me that if I struck oil it would make him rich. I agreed and told him I had left my purse at home and would like to borrow $2. He refused. So now he feels bad about that and happy over his fortune. So he sent me the cabbages. At this point the captain heard a carriage pull up in the front yard and looked out the window. Getting out were Joseph S. Cullinan and 2 other men. Cullinan was the most important oil man in Texas, a former Standard man. He had gone to Corsicana upon the invitation of the city officials, who were anxious to get an oilman to develop the industry. After failing to get backing elsewhere, he had called on Payne and Folger, two old Standard associates, who had agreed to back him. The assumption, natural enough, was that Cullinan was Standard-controlled. In company with Cullinan was T.J. Wood, another of the state's leading oil magnates, and Samuel M. Golden Rule Jones, the former socialist mayor of Toledo, who had opposed and defeated both the Republicans and Democrats. Ostensibly, the visit was for Cullinan to offer his congratulations to the captain and to bring a personal message from Calvin Payne. I talked with Mr. Payne last night, after hearing about the well, Cullinan said, and he asked me to extend his congratulations. To use his own words, "You certainly showed us." Cullinan asked what depth the oil was flowing from. Captain Lucas thought a few seconds before answering. Then he said 1,160 feet. Al Hamel was not certain whether the captain was deliberately misleading the Standard man, whether he actually believed that, or whether he had merely made a mistake in his almost uncontrolled excitement over success. Hamel knew the oil was flowing from the bottom of 51 joints of 20-foot pipe, and that the oil sand could be no deeper than 1,020 feet. But he kept his silence. Whether it was intentional or not, Lucas' error in the total depth he gave Cullinan was the first misrepresentation of a report on a well in the Gulf Coast, and it lived throughout the years to be emblazoned 40 years later on the monument located on the site of the Lucas well. Cullinan and his friends had breakfast at Carrie Lucas' insistence. When the meal was over, the party rowed out to the well. As they approached the derrick, the captain was surprised to see that the oil flow was apparently stronger, instead of continuing to diminish, as he had anticipated it would do. Peck Beard explained the situation to the captain. "She was getting weaker and weaker for a while, Captain," Peck said. "Then I'll be damned if she didn't stop altogether for almost a minute. I figured the show was over and was walking up to kiss her goodbye when the old fool blasted out again, like the Maine blowing up. Then a solid stream of oil started up and has been shooting stronger and higher than ever before." Cullinan looked at the well with deep admiration. He said it was the most magnificent thing he had ever seen. Lucas asked his advice about capping it, and Cullinan said he would not give such a suggestion if he had one. "It's too beautiful to stop, Captain," he said good-naturedly. "Let it flow like the Russian wells at Grozny and Baku." Captain Lucas and his family were sitting down to Sunday dinner, when the colored maid screamed and came running out of the kitchen. Mr. Captain," she shouted, "the oil well is on fire." The Lucas family rushed to the south window of the living room, overlooking the hill. A great mushroom of billowing smoke was rising, apparently from the well. Anthony Lucas looked and dropped to his knees for a moment of fervent prayer. Rising quickly, he dashed out the door to his horse and rode to the field. As he got closer, he could see that it was not the well, but waste oil that was burning. Several hundred spectators were fighting the flames away from the well. The captain joined them. Kurt Hamel had started fighting the fire with his jacket. Then an unidentified man who was crossing the hill in a wagon with his family, jumped out with a blanket and started swamping the flames, and horsemen, using their saddle blankets, joined in. Black smoke rose high in the clouds and swept over Port Arthur 10 miles to the south. Beaumonters could see the great column of smoke and flames and feared the worst. The blaze was under control in a short time, but not before it taught Lucas and the Hamels a lesson. From now on there would be no smoking. The fire had started from a discarded cigar. Thereafter no one was permitted within 50 feet of the spouter. John H. Galley barely had a chance to report on his Beaumont trip to Jim Guffey, back in Pittsburgh, when the wonderful news of the geyser of oil reached the offices of Guffey and Galley. Guffey hugged the lucky old oil hound, as he called Galley, and danced him around the office. "Now, get yourself back to Beaumont, and let me hear from you exactly what it is," Guffey said. "But Jim, aren't you coming with me? This thing sounds big enough for both of us," Galley rejoined. "No, John, no," was Guffey's reply. "If it is what it sounds like, those Mellon brothers are going to get a chance to finance an oil company that will make old John D. Rockefeller sick. Now hurry." All the way from Pittsburgh to Beaumont, the old wildcatter had stuck his head out the train window at every station, large or small, to buy the local newspapers and keep up with the progress of the big well. When he got to Beaumont, he was met by the captain and Jim Hamel. He insisted on getting a drink to celebrate. The captain said he didn't drink. Then he offered to buy him the biggest cigar in town. "No thanks," the captain didn't smoke. "Well, I'll be damned," Galley said. "And watch your language, John," Jim Hamel admonished. "The captain doesn't swear either." "I guess I can forgive him for his pious character, since he can damn sure find oil." Galley himself, a teetotaler who was quiet, modest, and deeply serious, said, with a rare resort to profanity. When Mike Welker, the ace reporter for the Enterprise, asked for an interview at the well, Galley strenuously objected. His resistance wore down. However, he said that the well would mark the beginning of the liquid fuel age. "We must demonstrate the permanency of supply and accumulate stocks. However, to be able to contract with fuel users for 15 or 20 years before we can expect them to change their boilers over from coal to oil," he said. "This will mean the investment of millions of dollars. It will mean that this well, the most wonderful thing I've ever seen in my life, must prove itself. Right now our problem is to get the flow under control. This waste can't go on." Galley told the press that he believed the flow was coming from an oil pool below the apex of the hill. After talking with the Hamels, Galley and the captain went to see Carolyn Lucas, who had prepared dinner. Galley told the proud woman that he gave her credit for the well. "You know," he said, "I have no doubt that if it hadn't been for your determination, the captain would have given up before he came to see me," and several times afterwards the captain agreed. The Hamels met with Lucas and Galley at the Crosby House the night of January 14th to discuss harnessing the well. Lucas presented a sheaf of telegrams and letters he had received offering suggestions for doing the job. It had been reported that Lucas was offering $10,000 to anyone who could control the well. The story was pure fiction, but Lucas had many responses. Fees asked ranged as high as $100,000. Some replies were from crackpots, but others were genuine. Jim Hamel said he and his brothers had an idea for trying to stop the flow, and that since they had brought the well in, they would like to have a chance to complete the job. Galley agreed that they were entitled to the chance. Their plan was outlined and approved. The necessary equipment was ordered from Corsicana that night. The Hamels realized they were taking on a job which involved a serious risk to their lives, as well as their reputations. They were not fools. They didn't cherish a flirtation with death. They were simply challenged by a problem that had never been encountered before. Along with other famous drilling teams like the Sharp brothers and the Sturm brothers, they were pioneers in oil field ingenuity. One of the first things they did was to work out a set of signals by which they could communicate with one another. In the midst of the well's deafening roar, they also realized that they would have to have protection from the oil and the noxious gas. Their outfit consisted of goggles, gauze shields for their noses, and plaster over their ears. The Hamels built a carriage inside the derrick. This was composed of 2 light railroad irons attached to the first girt above the floor. Then they bolted 2 by 8-inch plank supports to 6 by 4-inch boards to constitute a frame. Off to the side of the well, the gate valve was assembled with an 8-inch collar and an 8 by 6-inch swedge nipple with a 6-inch T. There was another nipple for the upright gate to be used for release. When everything was in readiness, the apparatus was to be launched against the column of oil. This was the critical part of the operation. A gate valve was placed over the casing to increase the diameter of the flow, leaving an area of play around the 6-inch pipe. The carriage was then successfully drawn over the well by block and tackle, in spite of the violent impact of the oil column. The assembly was drawn down by turning long screw bolts until the short nipple with an 8-inch T could be attached. This done, and the oil freely flowing through the vertical pipe, the gate was gradually closed, diverting the stream into the horizontal pipe. This gave the crew a chance to work around the well within the derrick and place foundations for anchorage to hold down both the apparatus and the casings. Old rope was caulked into the larger pipe around the 6-inch and secured with heavy wrought iron clamps, tightened with set screws to prevent the 6-inch pipe from moving upward. Finally, the gate valve on the horizontal pipe was gradually closed, and the flow of oil was completely shut off. It was a masterful operation and a demonstration of intelligence and ingenuity. A large mound of sand was thrown up over the wellhead assembly as a precaution against the well being destroyed by fire. When the operation was completed, the hundreds of people standing around the well, watching what was probably the construction and operation of the first oil field Christmas tree, as the wellhead valve assembly for controlling flow and pressure was called, let up a loud roar of applause. The weary and oil-saturated Hamels still had enough strength and sense of humor left to line up and bow to their audience. Today, the American oil industry is full of men like the Hamel crew. In those days, such outfits were scarce. Their pioneering on Spindletop Hill, aided by the genius of Captain Anthony Lucas, was one of the greatest contributions to the industry that was born there. Patillo Higgins didn't originate the name Spindletop, and he didn't like it much. It was the name given to a subdivision that was in proximity to and in competition with his Gladys city. But when he told reporters where he would stake his first well, he unintentionally gave the field the name that it would live with from that day forward. Higgins has always referred to the field as the Beaumont Oil Field in honor of his hometown. Captain Lucas, out of appreciation for the cooperation given him by Carroll and O'Brien, preferred and used Gladys City Field. The newspapers ruled out Big Hill when it was realized that 3 other coastal mounds bore the same name. One of them in Jefferson County, Higgins Hill, was once suggested, but was condemned by Higgins himself. After Batillo Higgins said he was going to drill in Spindletop Heights, that was it. In a very few weeks, Heights was dropped. The field became Spindletop, a name that would go down in history as the site of the greatest oil wells of all time and a living symbol of the oil industry. It was a few days before the well was capped that the word gusher came into use. Up until that time, this well, the first of its kind ever seen by anyone outside of Russia, was referred to as a spouter, or geyser of oil. A roustabout working in Perry McFadden's crew building the levees turned to one of the reporters and simply said, "Mister, that's some gusher, ain't it?" From that day on, the well was referred to as the Lucas Gusher, and the dictionaries soon had a new application for the word. Chapter 5. Birth of a Boom Town. The Lucas Gusher aroused the nation for 9 days, until it was controlled. A sprinkling of oil leaders from all over the country headed for Beaumont, and throngs of people flooded into the city from Texas and Louisiana. There was much talk, but little action. A flurry of sensational deals was recorded soon after the well came in, but a number of factors held off an immediate boom. For instance, it seemed significant that Standard Oil officials had swooped down on Beaumont almost immediately, but had withdrawn without entering the field. Even John Galley had expressed surprise at the early excitement, stating that it was unjustified because the product was not illuminating oil. Naturally enough, Galley didn't want too much activity at that point. Equipment and transportation were woefully short. Wary property owners took their land off the market, or placed their prices so high that no one would consider them. But probably the most widely circulated condemnation of all was contained in an interview given by E. Steiner, a West Virginia oil man. The statement, first made to the press in New Orleans, gained wide circulation over the country, and only the Beaumont newspapers took the time to answer it. Steiner said that the Beaumont field was a colossal accident, that the gusher was a crevice well, and that no other wells were likely to be found in the area. Furthermore, he said the oil was not marketable, and that the cost of drilling wells, about $5,000 apiece, was exorbitant. During all of this time, however, Beaumont wasn't exactly being deserted. Hundreds of people were making their way there every day. They were mostly the curious and the cautious, but there were some who did more than look and belittle. Batillo Higgins organized his company almost immediately. The best drilling contractors from Corsicana were being brought in. Of the outsiders, D.R. Beatty and the Haywood brothers were optimists in action. They disregarded the cautions and took a gamble while the odds were still long. They, along with Higgins, lost no time in assembling men, materials, and money. Shortly after the gusher was capped, Guffey and Galley had started 2 new wells. Beatty and the Haywood brothers were quick to acquire leases and start digging. It was Beatty who was to have the honor of actually opening the eyes of the world to the real meaning of Spindletop. He was a short, slender, energetic man in his early 40s, accustomed to long hours of work. He was a Galveston railroad and real estate promoter who had spent enough time in Corsicana to get oil in his veins and make valuable friendships with Texans in the industry. Beatty lost most of his possessions in the Great Galveston Hurricane, which occurred 4 months before Spindletop was discovered. Since then, he had been working his usual long hours on relief and rehabilitation committees in the devastated city. On the afternoon of January 10th, he was in the office of the Galveston News with a committee report when the telegraph operator rushed a dispatch to the editor. The message told of the geyser of oil 4 miles south of Beaumont, which was flowing an estimated 30,000 barrels of oil daily. Beatty was excited as the editor over the news when a special car left the island that night with newspaper men and others interested. Beatty was aboard. The banks were closed when the news came in, and he didn't take time to get more cash than the $20 he had in his pockets. Early the next morning, he was at the well, watching the phenomenal flow of oil sweep the skies and come raining down over the countryside. His imagination was fired, but he felt helpless with only a handful of money. He overheard Lige Adams say that he lived only a half-mile north of the well on a farm. Beatty didn't want to make Adams an offer there because he knew others might overhear and outbid him. He waited until the young man left and then followed him home. In the Adams home he found a little family that had moved to Spindletop Heights only a few months previously when Lige had been fired from his job as a millwright in Port Arthur. He met Miss Adams and their little daughter. Lige had paid $200 for 10 acres and was going to try farming. Right now he was out of money and needed some kind of work to pull him through the winter. Beatty told him that he would like to lease his land, but didn't have but a little more than $10 with him. Lige said he wasn't interested in a bonus as much as he was in a well. "Mr. Adams, I will get a well drilled here immediately if you will give me a lease," Beatty said. "In fact, I'll agree to start operations within 30 days, and I'll give you 1/8 of the oil." "That's a deal," Adams said, "on one other condition. Your crew will need a cook, and I need a job. Signed me on as cook when you start, and you can have the lease." Adams refused the $10 offered him, but Beatty turned to the little girl and gave her the money for a new dress. He returned to Galveston and obtained half of the backing he needed. He went to Corsicana and got the rest of it, plus one of the most famous and colorful drilling teams in the state, the Sturm brothers. The big job was getting the equipment to Beaumont by the deadline. On the last day, Bill and Jim Sturm managed to get the derrick and rig ready to go. It was a fight because they heard that Adams already had a much better offer waiting if the 30-day requirement were not met. Actual drilling began before the deadline, and after more than a month's operations, an hour before daylight on March 26th, Jim Sturm was blasted off the derrick floor and knocked out by a terrific charge of gas. Lige Adams was overcome by the fumes that drifted into the cooking shed. Both of the men were revived in time to see the column of oil start up and over the derrick for a producer almost as good as the Lucas gusher. The columnators were left choking on their words, and there were no more conservatives from that moment on. The happiest man in the world, besides Dr. Beatty, that day was W. Scott Haywood, Spindletop, which was the cradle of the modern oil industry, would produce hundreds of fabulous characters, but few more so than Scott Haywood, one of the four famous Haywood brothers of vaudeville and music. Scott was an adventurer. When the Klondike opened, he left the entertainment business to seek a fortune. With a little stake from that, he went to California and invested in oil. There he learned something of the business and made a little more money. On the morning of January 11th, Scott Haywood was having breakfast in a cafe in San Francisco when he learned of the Lucas gusher. The news story popped out at him, and he made up his mind immediately that this was the greatest opportunity on earth for a man who would act fast. He took time to send a telegram to his brother Dewey in Chicago to join him in Beaumont, but he didn't check out of his hotel or pack a trunk. The first train for Beaumont was leaving in 30 minutes, and he was determined to be on it. 24 hours might be the difference between a fortune and a failure. It was on the day and almost the hour that the Hamels were capping the Lucas well that Scott Haywood arrived in Beaumont. After checking into the Crosby, he hired one of the old Surreys to take him to the field. There he found the well almost deserted, except for a large crew that was cleaning up around it. The workmen he approached would not let him through the fence to see the well, but did call Elmer Dobbins, who identified himself as a driller. Haywood told Dobbins he was an oil man from California who was getting ready to drill on the hill. He wanted to look at the well, and if Dobbins were a driller, he might have a contract for him. Dobbins broke the rule, and Haywood got all the information he wanted. Dobbins, who had been lured by the bait all drillers snap at, an opportunity to become a contractor, later got the job Haywood promised him. But Scott Haywood had trouble for a while. He found a 15-acre tract owned by Keith and Ward, directly north of the well. He would have got it if he had had any money, but he missed out when Beatty gave $5,000 cash and 50% royalty. When after a few days Scott heard nothing from his brother Dewey, he became worried. However, Dewey showed up in a week. He had gone to Beaumont, California, when Scott failed to specify Texas in the telegram. Even then, however, the two didn't have enough money for the lease. They sent a telegram to the other two brothers, Alba and O.W., for help. The money came back with a telegram, which indicated their blind faith. It said, "Don't bother about details. You're on the ground. Play ball. Be careful at first base, but play ball." Now, with enough money to lease another 15-acre tract from the Higgins Oil Company, they took an option on the lease. Beatty was trying to tie that up, too, but Scott convinced the Higgins Company that it would be to their advantage to have a new operator in the field. Beatty, he said, already had leases and might not drill as many wells as soon as another operator would. It was at this point that Captain W.C. Tyrrell came into the picture. Captain Tyrrell was a prosperous businessman with holdings in Iowa, the Dakotas, Minnesota, and Texas. He was in Port Arthur inspecting some of his property when the Lucas well broke loose. Knowing little or nothing about the oil business, he kept alert for a good opportunity. Overhearing and observing the Haywood brothers convinced him they were dependable men who knew something about the business. The captain approached them one night and told them if they should need his financial help, he would talk with them. The next day they were in his office, explaining their problem. They had purchased the Higgins lease with a 30-day drilling obligation and needed $10,000 cash for equipment and a crew. If more were required, they would furnish it. Tyrrell gave the boys a $1,000 check as earnest money and said he would sleep over it. If he decided to go with them, he would give them a check for $9,000 the next morning. If not, they could have the $1,000. The next day Tyrrell gave the check for $9,000, and the first Haywood well was started. When the Beatty well came in, the Haywoods and Captain Tyrrell celebrated. They had good reason. Their first well was drilling exactly on a line halfway between the Lucas and Beatty gushers. They had nothing else to worry about. Scott Haywood then returned to California, got southwestern rights on an oil-burning stove and heater, the first of its kind outside of the Pacific coast. When he returned, his well was in, and the famous Haywood Brothers Oil Company was formed, with Captain Tyrrell as president. In the meantime, Guffey and Galley had brought in 2 more wells, and on April 18th, the first Higgins well came in. 6 wells had been drilled, every one a gusher. There were dozens of other success stories going out over the news wires. There was one about a commissary clerk who had recently bought 4 acres of land with his $60 savings to keep from spending the money imprudently. The boom came, and he sold out for $100,000. A Negro farmer with a small tract of land near the hill had been trying to sell out for $150 for 3 years. When the Lucas gusher came in, he was north of Beaumont, visiting relatives with his wife and children. Returning to Beaumont, he was puzzled by the turmoil. As he neared his home, he was met by a man who offered him $20,000 for his farm. The necessary papers were already made out, and all he had to do was sign and take the cash. When he reached home, he found another man waiting with $50,000 in cash, but it was too late. The early bird sold to the man waiting at the house, making $30,000 in 15 minutes. The same tract brought $100,000 after the Beatty well came in. A Miss Sullivan became known over the nation as Miss Slop. She had a small pig farm on the hill and made the daily rounds in Beaumont, collecting garbage in an old, dilapidated buckboard wagon. She sold a lease on her place for $35,000 one day, and the next day she resumed her garbage collections. A business failure from Missouri came to Beaumont with $20 and bought a lease on an acre. He sold it the same day for enough to retire on and live comfortably for the rest of his life. Tragedy and fortune struck one family a simultaneous blow. The head of the family got $50,000 for his small acreage on the hill and immediately went stark mad. Beatty sold his first well to C.D. Pullen of New York for $1,250,000, with $250,000 for his share and the other $1 million for his associates, all of whom became wealthy as the result of a total investment of less than $10,000. Beatty was an indefatigable worker who negotiated deals in the millions every day for months. His friends said he aged 15 years and 6 months under the stress of hard work, and that the average day of a New York broker was a quiet, pastoral one compared to his. It was said that no man ever engaged in business with Higgins, Lucas, the Haywoods, or Beatty who didn't become a millionaire, or at least extremely wealthy. Yet none of these ever entered into the frenzied stock schemes that were to follow. Lucas went so far as to throw 2 men out of his office when they proposed giving him $1 million worth of stock in a company for merely using his name. They admitted their land holdings were probably no good, after Lucas pointed out that fact to them, but they said that anyone would buy stock in a company named after him and in which he was a director and officer. Batillo Higgins filed 2 important suits in May of 1901. The first was against A.F. Lucas et al. For 1/10 interest he believed he was entitled to in the Lucas well. In this suit, he asked for $4 million. One of his contentions was that the first well Lucas drilled could have been brought in, but that it was capped instead. Later in the month, he filed suit against George W. Carroll, contending that Carroll had already made $2 million, of which Higgins was entitled to 10%, in accordance with their agreement. He contended that Carroll's deal with Lucas was based on Higgins' prediction that oil would be found in inexhaustible quantities. There were countersuits, and in the end a settlement was made to the satisfaction of everyone. In all of the legal contentions, however, there were no apparent hard feelings between Carroll and Higgins, who remained fast friends throughout. Higgins and Lucas, however, had no further relations, either good or bad. The Higgins suits did one important thing. They indicated for the first time in dollars the great value of the Lucas discovery. They were highly publicized, and people outside Beaumont paid little attention to any of the details, except the figures. Carroll in 3 months had made $2 million, and Higgins claimed that Lucas owed him $4 million, which was only 10% of the value of his holdings. These figures were highly exaggerated, of course, but everyone reading about them didn't realize that. Then shortly after the 6th well came in, some amazing facts were set out in conservative articles in leading manufacturing journals. Statistics are usually cold and uninviting, but the country was fascinated by the picture Spindletop presented. Half its 6 wells were capable of flowing more than the 68 million barrels annually, or 185,000 barrels daily, that Russia was producing as the leading oil country of the world. Obviously, as the field progressed, American leadership in petroleum would become more pronounced. This awakened a new national pride, which was tonic for the nation. Russia had pioneered the fuel oil field, particularly by powering steamships with oil from the Baku region. Now America would follow and go beyond that example, not only in ships, but in railroads, factories, and the home. As far as this country was concerned, there was only one oil company, and that was Standard. The others existed by sufferance of Standard. The Rockefeller monopoly had not hurt the general public, but it was a trust, a monopoly, and contrary to the principles of independence. Furthermore, at Spindletop, it had proved that as such it lacked imagination, or the will to venture by turning down the prospect on the hill, and even failing to get in early after Spindletop's real significance became evident. Those who have nothing want something, and will explore, invent, work, and gamble to get it. Standard had everything, and there was no incentive to expand unless doing so was a cinch for Standard. Now the statistics spelled doom for Standard's monopoly. Before Spindletop, Standard directly controlled 48 of the 58 million barrels of petroleum produced annually in the country, and by virtue of that fact alone, directed the disposition and price of the other 10 million barrels. The eastern fields of Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Ohio, New York, and Indiana accounted for 53 million of America's 58 million barrels of oil. Standard actually produced 22 million barrels of this oil and purchased 85% of the remainder at a fair average price of $1.13 a barrel. California produced 4 million barrels, and Texas produced another million barrels, mostly at Corsicana. There was a little production in Kansas, Colorado, Kentucky, and Wyoming. Outside of Russia, in the remainder of the world, there was oil production in small amounts in the Dutch East Indies, Austria-Hungary, and Romania. That was the world and national oil situation at the end of 1900, 10 days before the Lucas Gusher. Now the picture had changed. Not only was America to become the leading oil nation with the first 6 wells in Spindletop, but it would completely crack the oil monopoly. The Lucas well alone was capable of producing as much as 37,000 eastern wells, 6 times as much oil as California, twice as much as Pennsylvania, the leading oil state, and at least half of the nation's total output. With 5 additional wells, those figures could be multiplied until Spindletop's dominance became apparent to even the most difficult to convince. Russian oil 600 miles from Tidewater, and with a 46-cent tariff on every barrel, could not compete. Spindletop could produce more oil in one day than the rest of the fields of the world combined. These facts were staggering, yet true, and the great natural phenomenon of a mineral worth millions of dollars, gushing hundreds of feet into the air more freely than the geysers of hot water at Yellowstone, was enough to move a people to action and a feeling of new independence and national strength. The Beatty well had done the trick. Beaumont became the Mecca for every man who yearned for wealth. It was the door opener for a boom, where every man had a chance to make millions or go broke. It gave birth to the land of the big rich. Chapter 6. Pandemonium. There were no strangers. Every man was a boomer. The carnival spirit prevailed. It was like the stock market during a crisis, a battlefield during the attack, and a faro game where a fortune was won or lost on the turn of a card. This was no ghost walk or mere spectacular show. It was real. Deals involving millions of dollars were as common as popcorn sales at a fair. This was Beaumont, the home of Spindletop. From April 1901 until no man knew when, the brains and the brawn, the daring and the hopeful, the decent and the depraved, the young and the old, mingled and mixed. They spoke of oil and dollars and land and leases. Most of them had no knowledge of the subject. they were discussing, but they were on the ground floor. They were on the spot that the whole world was talking and reading about. No man was too big or too little. Anyone might have an option or an idea. Wealthy men slept in garrets and panhandled fresh food at nearby truck farms. Street urchins sold whiskey flasks of oil for a quarter until the chiselers cut the price to a dime. Men walked around with signs on their hats like giant press cards advertising land deals. Others took corners like newsboys and hawked leases and options. Hack drivers got rich charging $10 to $20 a person for trips to the hill in 6-passenger surreys and buses. Even buckboard wagons were pushed into service. The SP station and the Crosby House were ringed with buggies, surreys, and wagons. Men pushed and shoved and jostled each other good-naturedly, shouting, "Howdy, Boomer," as they collided. There was a scramble and a rush for space on trains to Houston, Port Arthur, and Orange every evening. Hundreds walked the streets when they found no place to sleep. Everywhere there was a sort of insanity. Every walk of life was represented. Every state and almost every land on the globe had some delegate present. It was a curious, carefree, oil-mad band of fortune hunters. On the registers of Beaumont hotels were senators and governors and cabinet members. There were names that were legendary to the average small-town Texan, names like William Jennings, Brian George J. Gould, John W. Gates, Andrew Carnegie, and the Rockefellers. As the days passed, more thousands poured in. The population rose above 50,000. Houston, 85 miles to the west, became the gateway to Beaumont. 6 trains daily were scheduled, and specials were running frequently. The favorite train was the all-Pullman that left Houston at 10 o'clock at night and arrived in Beaumont at 6 o'clock the next morning. Men would catch early afternoon trains back to Houston in time to return again the same night. They bought 30-day tickets in order to hold their reservations. The Crosby House became a center for this madness. It was an old frame building with 2 great galleries where men gathered day and night. The bar and the cafe became 24-hour operations, along with the remainder of the hotel. It was here that most of the traders chose to assemble. They would stand on tables and chairs, and offer to buy or sell leases. One night a man stood on a chair in the center of the lobby, waving $100,000 bills, which he was offering for a single acre in proven territory. The crowd laughed. That was the price a 20-foot lot would bring next to an oil well. The brokerage business became a new field of opportunity for the uncapitalized. All it took was shrewdness and energy, and it paid great dividends. The brokers would sell stock, leases, or land for a commission. Many of them became wealthy without investing a nickel or owning a drop of oil. The map vendors hawked their wares on the streets. They bought rough blueprints of the hill area for a dime and sold them for as much as $3. It was a cinch business. No man could operate without a map, and the maps didn't last long with the usage they were getting. Hundreds of thousands of them were sold. Land and leases were sold without abstracts or titles, and resold over and over on the same basis. They were sold solely on the word of the seller, backed by a small-scale map, where a slight error could mislead a buyer by several thousands of feet. There was seldom any effort at deception. The seller was usually selling his lease or property on the same basis that he had bought it, sight unseen. All deals were strictly cash. There were no time payments. If a man's credit was beyond question, his check or draft would be honored. Otherwise, it was greenbacks all the way. Money was a cheap commodity. It came into town in carloads from all over the nation to pay for stock. Silver dollars were stacked like cordwood in the banks, and railway stations. Men would come in and scoop it up in shovels and count it in back rooms. Trading, all transacted in cash, was done with notes of large denominations. It was not unusual to see a trader throw a $5 bill away when it got mixed up in his $100, $1,000, and $5,000 notes. There was no tie that bound. Old Jonas, the candy man, who had held forth in the Crosby lobby for years, had to give way to progress and madness. The flower and rose garden around the Crosby was cut up into 6-foot squares that were rented for $100 a month, each for office spaces, with simple 2x4 partitions between them. $1 million corporations took them over. Oil companies moved into every barn and abandoned shack in town and painted them red so the traders would know they were business of offices. Packing crates were fashioned into desks and set up on the curbings. Business houses that were not highly profitable gave way to new tenants. Even corners in saloons were rented out to oil corporations and promoters. Crockett Street moved west and got rough. It became Deep Crockett, the haven of the demi-monde, and the most notorious red light district in the Western Hemisphere, if not the world. It was a street of assignation, with brothels over every saloon, dance hall, and gambling house. One vaudeville house advertised its cribs for prostitutes off the balcony. Its risque and vulgar acts served as teasers for those who needed them. The girls would do the rest. The town saloons did a thriving business. The Crosby Bar was 6 and 8 deep all day and all night. The others were as busy. Although the class of trade was seldom as high, Mosso, a saloon keeper on Highland Avenue, made himself something of a local saint when he cleared the place every Sabbath morning to let a Sunday school class hold meetings. On its sawdust floors. As the meeting ended, the front of the place was always crowded with thirsty boomers who rushed in as the last child left. Every saloon keeper in town gladly paid a $50 fine each Monday morning for staying open on Sunday. Beaumont was drunk dry only once, and that was the Saturday after the Lucas well came in. After that, half the whiskey sold in Texas was consumed in Beaumont. Gambling halls were over every saloon with dice, poker, and faro tables running wide open. The small law enforcement agency was unable to cope with the situation, and for months did not even try. George Washington Carroll said many times that he would rather have lived forever without the wealth that came to him from oil than to see Beaumont become a city of iniquity. The men of Beaumont would not permit their wives or daughters to go into town without adequate escort. Many of them sent their families away and rented the spare rooms to the homeless. There were a few female clerks and stenographers and some woman lease promoters. There were hundreds of men for every woman in the daily turmoil of the streets, but most men were hell-bent for fortune and had little time to think of companionship. Probably the most annoyed of all Beaumont's citizens were its bankers. They kept their doors open for 12 and 16 hours a day, turning away thousands nightly even then. They seldom went out for a meal, and their work never ended. Yet what they did was done for practically nothing. There was no way to make a profit on deposits without loans, and no one wanted to borrow money at first. In spite of this, a half-dozen new banks opened in 1 year. Men walked the streets or slept in the sawdust piles at the mills because they could find no other accommodations. Every one of the squalid little hotels was filled to capacity. No man had a room alone. Every hotel room had from 4 to 20 cots, and the halls and lobbies were lined with cots or bare mattresses. Men slept on pool tables, in barber chairs, on rooftops, in pup tents, pyramidals, wall tents, and in lean-to shacks made of flimsy lumber. They slept on porches, in store windows, and wherever they could find a place to lie down. There might have been a dozen baths in Beaumont's hotels, but no one recalls them. Men who had been reared in fastidious surroundings went for weeks without bathing, rather than use the filthy tubs in barber shops. Beaumont's cistern water was not potable. Doctors warned the thirsty to drink whiskey or boiled water. This led to a new business. On street corners, vendors were selling boiled water out of wash tubs for a nickel a drink, and gallon jugs for $1. But even this didn't solve the problem. Soon, most of the visitors and natives were stricken with a particularly vexatious form of diarrhea that gained recognition the world over as the Beaumonts. This naturally led to other problems. The sanitary facilities available were almost medieval. Behind the Crosby were a half-dozen two-seaters before which lines of as many as 25 to 50 were standing constantly. Many a small boy made as much as $10 a day, lining up and selling his place to perturbed customers as they approached the door that led to the throne of relief. Keys were everywhere, in front of the post office, banks, the express office, and cafes. The cafes were filled to capacity every hour around the clock, and still all could not be fed. The prices were low, but the waiters expected big tips, and when they didn't get them, the items on the menu became scarce. The low tippers became marked men. A party of 4 might pay $2 for 4 full-course dinners, but if they tipped less than $5, they were thereafter ignored. Many families opened soup kitchens on their porches. Madame Lamont established herself in the Cordova Hotel, a local bandbox, and began to foretell to the gullible at $10 a prophecy where to buy and when to sell. Within a month, she tried to buy the hotel and the block it stood on. When her predictions started to turn sour, however, she departed with 2 valises of cash. The stories that were going out of Beaumont by mail and wire to the newspapers of the world were fairly accurate, but those that were being sent out to Dallas, Austin, and San Antonio by writers who had never seen the place were lurid and fantastic. They were responsible for many of the millions of dollars invested by those who knew nothing of the true situation. The larger newspapers sent their own correspondents, and for the most part got excellent, accurate coverage. The truth was enough to stir people, but the pipe dreams led to confusion. Beaumont newspapers almost stopped once, however, due to the boom. Through a series of trades one night in a saloon, a Beaumont printer pyramided his weekly paycheck into $30,000. He got every printer in town drunk, and the newspapers virtually stopped. They advertised for out-of-town printers, but as they arrived in town, they were met by the local craftsmen and invited to the party. It took 2 weeks to spend the $30,000, after which everyone returned to his type case and press. The local newspaper situation revived faster than its printers did from their hangovers and the wrath of their women. Spindletop was all things to all men. The Fords, Oldses, Packards, Durias, Hayneses, and even the Wrights saw it in the answer to their greatest problem. President McKinley and Teddy Roosevelt saw it as the dawn of a new age for America, based on a limitless source of energy. Railroads and steamship operators looked upon it as opening new opportunities in trade by drastically reducing the cost and increasing the comfort of transportation. John W. Gates said that the discovery, coupled with automotive advancements, would bring all Americans together as neighbors through a system of good roads. Only the coal barons and Standard Oil magnates looked upon it with misgivings. They saw their monopolies threatened. As the weeks rolled by, the swindlers rolled in. The fake stock company became the bane of Beaumont's existence. Companies were formed on nothing more than a lease on a quarter of an acre of land somewhere in Texas. $1 million corporations became the order of the day. 4 such corporations were formed on 1 quarter-acre tract with a single well on a hill. The pattern was for some man without a cent to organize a $1 million corporation, sell stock, and set himself, his relatives, and friends up in jobs with fabulous salaries. They took money from the poor, the feeble, and the lame with impunity. Some investors bought land which, when investigated, proved to be far out in the Gulf. Within a year after the field was discovered, there were more than 500 Texas corporations doing oil business in Beaumont. Hundreds of others were chartered in other states. Most of those were companies headed by men with no other intention except bilking the public. The real oil men would have nothing to do with them. Men like Higgins, Haywood, Cullinan, Lucas, and the others did not put their stock on the market. They constantly urged the public to beware of stock promotions. The heads of the promotional companies knew nothing about the oil business. They had no idea of its possibilities and cared less. They were in the money racket. They knew only that men bored holes in the ground, got oil in great quantities, and that it was supposed to represent wealth. They didn't know and didn't tell their shareholders that there was no market for the oil or that the price was dropping lower every day. Lithographing companies in Houston, New Orleans, and Galveston were working 24 hours a day printing stock certificates, and still could not keep up with the orders. Men were paid fancy salaries to do nothing but sign the certificates after filling them out. Some of these certificate men worked for a half-dozen companies, getting paid on the basis of the amount of stock they signed. Many of them received executive titles, such as secretary, treasurer, or vice president. The newspapers of the nation were flooded with full-page advertisements of gilt-edge oil stocks. Boyce's monthly magazine gave away a share of stock in some hopeless company with every subscription, promising wealth for nothing. Probably the most ludicrous promotion of all was won by a group of Texans. They advertised young George Finley of Uvalde as the boy with the X-ray eyes, who could see through the strats of the earth and find oil. Incredible as it seems, thousands of shares of stock were sold in the company promoting Finley. Even the most respected of the news services was sucked in when the company actually found oil at 1,100 feet, where Finley had seen it. The story neglected to tell that it was at that depth that almost everyone else found oil, and that the Finley location was surrounded by existing producers. One of the most successful companies was headed by Colonel E. M. House of Austin, later advisor to President Wilson, and a group of Northern capitalists. They purchased the streets and alleys from the Gladys City Company for $90,000. That gave them a perfect gridiron of 2/3 of the hill. The effect was that the company did not have to drill to prove its acreage. Anywhere anyone else drilled would do that. There were few smarter ideas ever conceived. The company was capitalized for $1 million, and the stock was sold out in less than 36 hours. The sale of dedicated streets and alleys finally led to legal pyrotechnics, but not before it provided a fat dividend for the Gladys City stockholders, and added a fascinating chapter to the crazy quilt work of the Spindletop picture. The hectic speculations of this period are typified by the experience of a railroad brakeman who came to town early, paid $1 for a lease on a quarter of an acre, organized a multi-million-dollar corporation, and put himself on a $10,000 a month sinecure, or by that of a reporter for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, who stopped off the train and was met by a man who offered him a lease in the Bullock Survey for $1,000. Knowing nothing of the land, the reporter hesitated. Another St. Louis man behind him bought the lease. The next day the two met on the street, and the reporter asked the purchaser if he considered his action wise. His fellow townsman replied that he certainly did, because he had sold the lease 2 hours later for $5,000. He said he was not wise for selling so soon, however, because he had seen the lease change hands again within a matter of hours for $20,000. Every conceivable type of stock company was being formed. Some of them were legitimate, but they were in the minority. A group of Beaumont and New York women organized the Young Ladies Oil Company and threatened to build one of the greatest organizations in the field by their aggressiveness. They actually did go farther than most others, and very little was lost by the stockholders. There was a Lucky Dime Company, organized by a group of Galveston men who sold stock for 10 cents a share. Within a few days, there was a 1-penny oil company selling its stock for a cent a share and bringing down the wrath of the oil men, who saw in this an unholy method of extracting pennies from the children and the childish. Order came out of chaos to some extent when Sam Park and others organized the Beaumont Oil Exchange. There at least those who wanted to have protection from the swindlers could get it. The exchange set up offices in an old store building at Orleans and Laurel Streets and announced it was open for 100 members. Some of those who hadn't been wealthy long enough to forget the value of $1 objected to the $3 monthly dues. Park told them he preferred more active men anyway and took in others. When the conservative old Beaumonters, including many who had ignored Patillo Higgins years before, saw the exchange was going to succeed without them, they decided to come in, but it was too late. All of the seats were sold. Patillo Higgins was elected an honorary member in recognition of his great service to his native city by locating the enormous wealth under its surface. The exchange lasted only a year, but it inspired oil exchanges in Houston and also New Orleans. Excursion trains were coming into Beaumont in an endless chain. One Sunday in May, more than 15,000 poured off of trains and traipsed through mud, gumbo, and oil. There were men, women, and children in their best clothes. In their excitement, they were oblivious to the grave danger they faced. At times rocks and shale rained down around them like flak from anti-aircraft weapons. There were times when the mere striking of a match could have engulfed the entire mob in flames. As it was, some passed out from the gas fumes, but the others paid little attention to that in their enthusiasm for the phenomenal display they were viewing firsthand, and which had been built up by publicity. Full-page advertisements, brochures, circular letters, and word-of-mouth salesmanship. When the excursionists boarded the train to return home, they were in the hands of professional stock salesmen. Their only question was, how fast can I get rich? When things didn't pan out as they expected, they called the great oil field Spindletop. The excursions from the east particularly were sheer promotions organized by outfits like the King Crowther Excursion Company. The ride didn't cost much, as the stock companies paid most of that. Many stock companies sold out completely with a single excursion. In spite of the fact that every man in Beaumont with anything to rent, sell, or lease was getting richer by the day, the hometowners grew weary of the boom long before it was over. When the rains came and swamped the streets with mud, making it necessary to cross them with rowboats on occasion, there was some hope that the end was in sight, but nothing stopped the mad pace. Wagons and horses were almost lost in the mud. On some occasions, locomotives would tie onto vehicles to extract them while men sat around betting on whether the wagon would come out whole or in half. Men, delirious with the desire to get rich, waded waist deep in the bog when it was too muddy to ride to the field by horse or horse-drawn vehicle. Men actually walked the 4 miles through mud and mire. Al Hamel frequently rode a horse from the hill to George Carroll's home on the edge of town. Then he walked the rest of the way on boardwalks. The last mile was too tough for horses on the mud streets. Beaumont was an amazing place until the day the boom broke. Robert E. Lee the barber had 20 chairs in his shop across from the post office. They were never empty. When the shop doors were opened at 7 o'clock every morning, 75 to 100 men were clamoring to get in. Barbers made $100 a week in commissions and virtually doubled that in tips. Lee had to keep change for $1,000 bills, which he frequently got. Men would pay to spend the night in his barber chairs and would padlock suitcases to their legs. The suitcases frequently contained as much as $100,000 in cash. One day, D.P. Wheat, Beaumont's rotund mayor, who usually sported a top hat, cane, gloves, ascot tie, and a large gold watch, FOB, called a meeting of the citizens. Something, he said, had to be done for the visitors. Before the meeting was over, the old auditorium was turned into a hall of cots, where from 200 to 300 could sleep at one time in 6-hour shifts, and the ladies of the Christian church set up a coffee and sandwich bar in the old post office building, the WCTU, horrified by the doctors who warned people to drink whiskey in preference to Beaumont cistern water, established free watering corners, providing boiled water for those who preferred it to hard liquor. Even the errors at Beaumont were fabulous. One company, by mistake, sold $1 million worth of stock, based on a lease which was found not to exist. No one got his money back when the company failed. Another time a promoter organized a company and sold every share of stock in it before he discovered that the land he had was worth twice as much as the company was capitalized for. His stockholders took over the company and kicked him out, presumably for using bad judgment. One day, Jim Hogg picked up a sulfur pyrite blown out of one of his wells, fastidiously announced that it was gold, and the next day it was all Beaumont could do to keep from being invaded by a gold rush, in addition to all its other troubles. The story got so good that Hogg, momentarily taken in by his own doings, seriously considered organizing a gold mining company. The native Beaumonters always did things in the grand manner. When the new Kyle Opera House, one of the finest in the entire South, was opened, Beaumont's new rich went upstage. The men would come in from the field covered with mud and oil, change into white tie, high hat, and tails for an evening at the opera. It was shortly after the Discovery well came in that the city council passed an ordinance against drilling inside the city limits. This ordinance kept many Beaumont small homeowners from getting rich quick. Within weeks, every acre of land within a 30-mile radius of the hill was under lease or had been sold. Farmers who were not stubborn or stupid made more money in one deal than their farms could be expected to produce in a lifetime of toil. Calder Avenue was Beaumont's silk stocking row, the home of the first families, but it extended beyond the city limits. When Sam McNeely announced that he would drill for oil on his 4 lots along the swanky boulevard, a mass meeting resulted. He sold the land for his own price immediately after the meeting. All of this Patillo Higgins watched with justifiable amusement. In order that others might not forget, he placed an enlargement of his old Gladys City Oil, Gas, and Manufacturing Company letterhead of 1892 in the lobby of the Crosby House. There were the storage tanks, the smokestacks, the oil derricks, and the activity. Had he been able to sell the stock in that one company, it would have controlled everything. Beaumont was the mecca of the fortune hunters, but for every man who got rich there, hundreds lost every dime they had.